Malik Harris's fingers were still dusted with sawdust when his neighbor held out a business card to him across the crooked gate. His dark brown hands instinctively brushed the wood shavings off on his jeans before he took it. The young woman had been watching him for almost 3 hours now, quietly, steadily, while he rebuilt her collapsed fence plank by plank. She'd seen him measure every angle twice, check his level a third time, reinforce corners that technically didn't need reinforcing, and calculate weight distribution like he was designing a bridge rather than fixing a suburban boundary line. She had asked small, almost casual questions about his technique, about how he knew where the load would sit, about why he bothered adding diagonal braces on a simple yard fence, about his past, about why a man who clearly thought in structures and stress loads was spending his Saturday afternoon doing handyman work. Malik had shrugged it off with a half smile and a "guess I just like things done right" before returning to his drill. He didn't look at the card until he slid behind the wheel of his old pickup, the engine coughing to life. Only then, with his 7-year-old son Jalen humming quietly in the passenger seat, did he glance down. Olivia Grant, Chief Executive Officer, Grant Urban Holdings. Malik's hands froze on the steering wheel. He knew that name. Everyone in Lakewood did. Grant Urban Holdings owned half the downtown skyline, shopping plazas, office towers, luxury apartments, even the old railway depot redevelopment. They weren't just landlords, they were the landlords. He'd just spent his entire afternoon rebuilding a fence for the woman who controlled more real estate in this town than the city council. He had no idea that one simple act of neighborly kindness would drag him back toward the dream he'd buried in the wreckage of his grief 3 years ago. And he couldn't possibly know that within a week, that same woman would put a choice in front of him that would split his life cleanly into a before and an after. Hold on to the safe, small life he'd built around his son, or risk everything to resurrect the career he'd walked away from the day his world shattered. That Saturday had begun like 100 others, quietly, almost comfortingly ordinary. Malik was up at 6:15 a.m., padding barefoot into the small kitchen as the first light slid through the blinds. He cracked eggs into a bowl, whisked them with a splash of milk and a pinch of pepper, dropped bread into an aging toaster that sometimes needed a smack to behave. Jalen slid into his usual seat at the wobbly wooden table, sleep still clinging to his lashes. Sunlight framed the boy's face, warming the deep brown of his skin, picking out the gold flecks in his eyes. The same eyes his mother had had. Every time Malik looked at that face, his chest pulled tight with something that was equal parts love and responsibility, and a grief that had stopped being sharp and had settled into a permanent ache. "You want cheese today?" Malik asked, forcing his voice light. "Yeah, the yellow kind, not the orange kind," Jalen said, deadly serious, as if the fate of the world hinged on the right cheddar. Malik smiled despite himself and sprinkled shredded cheese into the pan. Jalen traced shapes into the condensation on his juice glass, little circles and triangles that turned into blocky buildings when Malik squinted at them. "You know, that kind of attention to detail," Malik said, pointing with the spatula. "That's architect behavior," Jalen grinned. "Like you used to be." The words jabbed Malik in the ribs, but he nodded. "Yeah, like I used to be." 3 years ago, he'd been working late at an architecture firm downtown, half lost in a set of elevation drawings for a new mixed-use tower, when his phone had rung and his life had split into a before and an after. Wet roads, a truck that didn't see the light, an impact, a hospital waiting room with bad coffee and worse fluorescent lighting, a doctor's voice that started with, "We did everything we could," his wife Amara, gone in a single senseless moment. In the weeks that followed, deadlines and design competitions and client calls became meaningless noise. The only thing that mattered was the little boy who woke up in the middle of the night asking where mommy was, who clung to Malik's shirt like it was the last solid thing in a collapsing world. So Malik had walked into his partner's office and said 4 words he never thought he'd say: "I can't do this." He'd left the firm, taken a job as a building maintenance tech for a local property company. Steady hours, predictable pay, no midnight client panics. He learned to fix leaky faucets and dying water heaters, to patch drywall and swap out flickering ballast lights. It paid half of what he'd earned designing buildings from the ground up, but it gave him something the firm never had. He could drop Jalen off at school. He could be there when the final bell rang. He could cook dinner every night in their cramped but warm little rental. It wasn't the life he dreamed of. It wasn't the career his professors had once said had national award potential. But it was steady. It was safe. And after the chaos of grief, safe felt like mercy. On weekends, Malik picked up odd jobs around the neighborhood, painting porches, fixing steps, installing ceiling fans in living rooms that smelled like pot roast and lemon cleaner. He told himself he was content. That designing buildings had belonged to another version of him, one who had the luxury of working late and chasing accolades. That version of him died on the highway with Amara. Around 10 a.m. that Saturday, after breakfast dishes were rinsed and stacked in the sink, Malik dropped Jalen off at a friend's house across town for a playdate. The boy chattered about a Lego skyscraper he was building and how his teacher said he had a math brain. Malik drove with one ear tuned to his son and the other to the hum of the old engine. His attention split between the present and the ghost of the future he'd once imagined. On the way back, he saw it. A jagged gap in the neat line of fences that marched along Willow Lane, two panels of weathered boards completely blown out, posts listing at a tired angle. Last night's storm had been rough, sheets of rain, wind that made the windows rattle, but this section had taken the worst hit. On the porch of the small gray bungalow, a woman stood with her arms folded, staring at the damage as if willing it to fix itself. Malik had noticed her in passing over the last 2 months, always alone, always in jeans, hoodies, simple sweaters. She drove a sensible, slightly battered sedan. She kept odd hours, sometimes leaving before dawn, sometimes taking calls late into the night on the porch with her back to the street. The other neighbors gossiped, imagining everything from remote tech worker to burned-out grad student. No one guessed real estate mogul. Malik didn't think. He just pulled his truck to the curb, killed the engine, and grabbed his toolbox from the bed. In this neighborhood, people still helped each other. You jump-started cars in winter, lent sugar when someone was halfway through a recipe, watched each other's kids when schedules went sideways. Fixing a fence after a storm was just an extension of that unwritten contract. The grass in her front yard was a little too long, damp from the storm. Malik's work boots left faint imprints as he crossed to the broken section. Up close, he could see the rot at the base of the posts, the rusted nails, the telltale bowing that said this fence had been waiting for an excuse to fall. The woman turned at the sound of his footsteps. Up close, she looked younger than he'd thought, maybe late 20s. Light brown skin, dark hair pulled back into a low, practical ponytail, eyes that missed nothing. They flicked over the toolbox, the calluses on his hands the way he examined the damage. "Hey," Malak said, offering a small, unobtrusive smile. "Wind hit you pretty good, huh?" "Yeah." Her voice was low even, with the tiniest trace of exhaustion threaded through it. "I heard the crash at 3 a.m. I was hoping it would look better in daylight." "No such luck," he said, crouching to inspect the base of a post. "You mind if I take a look? I do maintenance work for a living. I've rebuilt more fences than I can count." Suspicion warred briefly with relief in her eyes. Then she nodded. "Be my guest. I'm Olivia, by the way." "Malik?" he said, "from 2 houses down." "I know," she replied. "I've seen you and your son walking to the bus stop." The fact that she'd noticed that made something he didn't want to name flutter in his chest. He focused on the wood instead. The next hours fell into a rhythm that was strangely soothing. Remove the broken boards, assess the posts, dig out the worst of them and set new ones with quick-set concrete Malik had in his truck, just in case. A phrase that had become his unofficial motto. Measure, cut, drill, level, repeat. He worked the way he always did when tools were in his hands, carefully, methodically, maybe a little obsessively. If he was going to do something, he was going to do it properly. Storm-proof, kid-proof, time-proof. An hour in, Olivia appeared beside him with 2 plastic cups beaded with condensation and a pitcher of lemonade. She set them on an overturned crate, watching as he reinforced a corner in a way most casual handymen wouldn't bother with. "Why that diagonal brace?" she asked, nodding toward the new piece of lumber. "Isn't the vertical support enough if the posts are sunk deep?" Malik blinked. That wasn't the question of someone making polite small talk. That was the question of someone who understood loads and lateral force. Wind, he said slowly. The gusts don't just push straight on, they pull and twist. The brace spreads the force, keeps the boards from bowing out over time. And you calculated that in your head, she said, not inflecting it as a question. He gave a small shrug. Once you spend enough years with structural equations, the numbers kind of stick. Her eyes sharpened. You studied engineering? Architecture, he admitted, aiming for offhand. A long time ago. What made you switch to maintenance? Malik could feel her looking not just at his hands but through his answers, weighing something. He slid the drill from one hand to the other, kept his tone casual. Life, he said, and a kid who needs me home at dinner. Maintenance lets me do that. Olivia nodded once, as if that answer slotted something into place in her head. Fair enough. She didn't pry further, and he was grateful. Talking about Amara still felt like pressing on a bruise that never fully faded. By mid-afternoon, the fence stood straighter than it had in years. The line of boards was clean, the joins tight, the gate rehung to swing smooth and true without scraping the ground. Malik wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist and stepped back, checking the long line out of habit, as if it were a facade downtown and not a suburban privacy fence. Olivia stood beside him, arms folded loosely, eyes following his gaze. You're not going to let me pay you, are you? She asked. Not a chance, he said immediately. Neighbors don't charge each other for storm damage. Besides, your posts were a challenge. I should be paying you for entertainment. That drew the first real smile he'd seen from her all day. A quick, genuine thing that softened the hard edges of her face. In that case, Sean, she said, turning toward the house, wait here 1 second. She disappeared inside and returned moments later with a small off-white rectangle between two fingers. Then at least take this, she said, holding it out. In case you ever need anything. He took the card, glanced at it without really seeing it, more focused on getting home to start dinner before picking up Jalen. Thanks, Olivia, he said. And seriously, if anything starts to sag or creak or look funny, just knock on my door. He tossed the toolbox back into the bed of the truck, slid into the driver's seat, and stuffed the card into the dash tray almost reflexively. It wasn't until later, when Jalen was buckled in beside him, chattering about how he'd totally beaten Marcus at Mario Kart, that Malik, at a red light, idly plucked the card back up and actually read the text. Olivia Grant, Chief Executive Officer, Grant Urban Holdings. The name hit him like someone had opened a window during a snowstorm. Cold air rushed into his chest, displacing his breath for a heartbeat. Grant Urban Holdings. He heard in his mind the way people said that name, the way his old colleagues had used it as shorthand. If only we could land a Grant Urban project. They owned the Hudson Tower, the Lakeside Plaza, the 1012 Lofts conversion that had made it into an architecture magazine Malik still couldn't bring himself to read. They were the reason downtown had gone from half-vacant to up-and-coming in under a decade. And the woman who had just watched him over-engineer her fence for 3 hours, in an old hoodie and worn sneakers, ran it. You okay, Dad? Jalen asked, frowning at him. Malik realized the light had turned green, and the car behind him had honked just once. He exhaled, slid the car back onto the dash, and forced his foot down on the gas. Yeah, buddy, he said. Just surprised about something. That night, after Jalen was in bed and the little house had gone quiet except for the hum of the fridge, Malik sat at the same worn kitchen table with his old laptop. The business card lay beside it, a tiny, innocuous rectangle that suddenly felt like a weight. He typed Grant Urban Holdings into the search bar. Page after page of projects, profiles, glossy photos of glass and steel and carefully lit lobbies filled the screen. Downtown Lakewood, before and after. A city reborn through strategic investment and sharp eyes. At the center of most of the newer articles, there was a quote, a reference, or sometimes a photo. Olivia Grant, the quiet powerhouse who'd taken her late father's modest construction outfit and turned it into a regional real estate empire by 30. There she was in one article, in a dark blazer, hair slicked back, standing in front of a newly renovated office tower. Her expression was the same focused one he'd seen on the porch while she'd watched him drill in that diagonal brace. She lived in a modest bungalow on Willow Lane. She drove a 5-year-old sedan with a dent in the bumper, and she controlled more square footage in this city than anyone Malik had ever met. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the card. Why had she stood outside for 3 hours watching him work? Why those specific questions about load paths and wind shear? Why the vague, in case you ever need anything? He told himself it was nothing. Rich people liked having competent handymen on speed dial, that was all. Maybe she had other properties and needed someone who wouldn't cut corners. That would be good for business. A few extra jobs, a little breathing room in the budget for Jalen's field trips and birthday parties. Still, when he finally shut the laptop and lay down in his bed, the questions followed him into sleep. The answer came sooner than he expected. On Monday afternoon, Malik was wedged into a cramped utility closet at the Oakview Apartments, wrestling with a stubborn water heater that refused to cooperate when his phone buzzed in his back pocket. He almost ignored it. Tenant complaints came first, and Mrs. Alvarez in 304 had already called twice about her lack of hot water. But something about the unknown number on the screen made him swipe. "Hello, this is Malik." "Mr. Harris." The voice on the line was calm, composed, unmistakable. "It's Olivia, from Willow Lane." He shifted the phone to his other ear, trying to keep it from slipping as he balanced on the edge of the heater. "Oh, hey Olivia, everything okay with the fence?" "The fence is perfect," she said. "Better than perfect, actually. That's partly why I'm calling." His stomach did a small, inexplicable flip. "I'm renovating an old office building downtown," she continued. "The Carson block on 5th. It's complicated. I'd like a fresh set of eyes from someone who understands structure, not just surface. Someone who doesn't talk like a sales brochure." Malik frowned, a smear of dust across his forehead. "You want me to take a look at it?" "I'm not a contractor, Olivia. I just do maintenance now." "I know exactly what you just do," she said lightly. "I watched you redesign a fence from the ground up for no money, and I heard you talk about wind loads like you were thinking in equations. I did a little checking. You used to be an architect. A good one? From what I saw in a couple of old project credits." Heat crept up the back of his neck. He hadn't expected her to Google him. "Look," she said, tone shifting to businesslike. "This isn't an offer, not yet. I'm asking if you'd be willing to walk the building with me. Give me your honest professional impressions, even if you think the whole thing should be bulldozed. I'll pay you for your time. No strings, no commitment." In the cramped closet, the smell of metal and dust and old water pressed in on him. Malik stared at the rusted pipe in front of him and felt the old life he'd locked away stir, just slightly, like something waking up in the dark. Every instinct shouted that this was dangerous, that nothing good came from stepping back into the world he'd abandoned, that Jalen's stability depended on paychecks he could predict and hours he could control. "Why me?" he heard himself ask quietly. On the other end of the line, Olivia was silent for a beat. "Because," she said finally, "I watched you treat a fallen fence like it mattered, like it deserved to survive the next storm. Not just the last one. I don't need someone who can make a building look pretty on a rendering. I need someone who cares about whether it still stands in 30 years. You work like someone who thinks in decades. That's rare." His throat tightened. "I'm not asking for a decision about anything beyond a walkthrough," she added. "Say yes, you look at the building. You tell me what you see. Say no, I won't ask again, and we'll still be neighbors who trade waves in the driveway." Malik looked down at his hands. Scarred knuckles, short nails, a smear of sealant on his wrist. Maintenance hands. Father hands. The water heater hissed softly, a reminder of the job in front of him, of the life he'd built around small, solvable problems. "Can I think about it?" he asked. "Of course," Olivia said. "Take the day. I'll text you the address. If I don't hear back, I'll assume it's a no. If I do," he could hear the faintest hint of a smile in her voice, "then we'll see if that fence was a fluke." They hung up. Malik stood in the cramped closet for a long moment, phone still in his hand, heart beating just a little too fast. On the tiny screen, Olivia's text arrived with a soft chime. "Carson Block, 5th and Maple, Thursday, 3 p.m. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, turned the wrench on the heater valve with more force than necessary, and told himself he should say no. It was safer, cleaner, simpler. But all afternoon, as he moved from unit to unit, from leaky faucets to faulty outlets, the image of a vacant building he hadn't even seen yet tugged at the edges of his mind. The idea of walking through it, of tracing old beams with his fingertips, and imagining what could be instead of just what was, that thought refused to go quiet. That night, long after Jalen had fallen asleep clutching his favorite comic book, Malik sat alone in the small living room, the business card on the coffee table in front of him. The television flickered soundlessly in the background. The city lights beyond the blinds pulsed faintly against the dark. He picked up the card, turned it between his fingers. Grant Urban Holdings, architect, father, widow, maintenance tech. These were all true things about him, but which ones would define the rest of his life? By the time the clock crept toward midnight, he knew that no wasn't honest. It was fear dressed up as practicality. Malik exhaled, unlocked his phone, and opened Olivia's text. "I'll be there Thursday," he typed. 3 p.m. works. He hit send before he could talk himself out of it. The message left the screen with a quiet whoosh that sounded, in that small room, far louder than it was. For the first time in 3 years, as Malik turned off the lamp and headed down the hall to check on his sleeping son, his heart felt something beside the dull weight of survival. It felt unsettled, uneasy, on the edge of something. He didn't know it yet, but a fence on Willow Lane had just become the first line in the blueprint of a completely different future. Thursday afternoon, Malik stood on the sidewalk at 5th and Maple and stared up at the Carson block as if it were a ghost. The 6-story structure loomed over the corner like an old soldier, scarred, tired, but somehow still dignified. Faded brick, blank windows, boarded-up ground-floor storefronts tagged with graffiti. A crooked for-lease banner flapped half-heartedly in the breeze, its corners sun-bleached to nearly white. He'd driven past this building hundreds of times over the years. Back when he'd worn button-down shirts and carried a leather portfolio, he'd even daydreamed about what he'd do with it if a miracle client handed him the keys. Now he stood on the cracked sidewalk in work boots and a clean but inexpensive shirt, clutching a simple folder of lined paper and a cheap mechanical pencil. He almost turned around. "This is stupid," he muttered under his breath. "You fix water heaters now. You don't fix skylines." "Mr. Harris?" He spun around. Olivia was walking toward him from the corner, a leather messenger bag slung across one shoulder. Her hair was down today, curling slightly at the ends, and she wore a navy blazer over a white blouse. The hoodie and jeans were gone. This was the version of her from the articles, CEO, not neighbor, but the eyes were the same, sharp, measuring, a little tired. "Malik, please," he corrected automatically. "Then it's Olivia," she replied. "Ready?" That was an excellent question. He swallowed. "I guess we're about to find out." She swiped a key card at the side entrance, and the heavy metal door clicked open. Inside, the air was cooler and smelled faintly of dust, old carpet, and the ghost of cigarette smoke from a time when people still lit up at their desks. The lobby was dark except for the light filtering in from the street through the glass doors. Old mailboxes lined one wall. A cracked tile floor hinted at better days, patterns lost beneath grime. Malik's fingers itched to see what lay under the dirt, to imagine it polished, restored, appreciated. They took the stairs. Olivia claimed the elevator was temperamental on his best day, and climbed to the top floor. As they emerged into the 6th-floor corridor, Malik's breath caught. The space was completely open. Whoever had last tried to modernize the building had apparently gutted the old warren of offices, leaving huge, uninterrupted floor plates. Exposed concrete columns marched in steady rhythm toward a line of tall windows that wrapped the perimeter. Half the glass was filthy. Some panes were cracked. But the light, soft, high, generous, poured in across the dusty floor in long, glowing rectangles. In Malik's mind, something that had been half asleep sat up. "It's ugly right now," Olivia's voice echoed slightly in the emptiness, "but I can't shake the feeling there's a heart in it worth saving. Problem is, every firm I've talked to wants to either strip it completely or blow half the budget on a skin-deep facelift. No one talks about what the building needs, just what will photograph well. Malik walked slowly toward the windows, his boots crunching on a line of broken plaster. His hand brushed the nearest column, fingers tracing the cool roughness. The bones are good, he said before he could stop himself. Look at the spacing. They used generous grids back then. You could easily run open-plan offices along the perimeter and carve collaborative spaces into the middle. He crouched near a hairline crack in the floor, eyes narrowing. Floor's holding. There's some spalling, but nothing catastrophic. What's your load rating on the old plans? 80 pounds per square foot, Olivia said without checking a note. We'd need to reinforce if tenants want heavy server rooms or file storage, but standard office use should be fine. Malik glanced up, genuinely impressed. You read the structural reports yourself? I read everything myself, she said. It's my money on the line. He moved from window to window, seeing not the grime, but the way the building faced the light. How the southern exposure could be filtered, how the western glare could be tamed with exterior fins, how you could carve a central atrium through the middle floors and pull daylight deep into the core. He found himself talking as he walked, ideas spilling out of him without permission. If you cut a void here, he said, gesturing with the pencil, you could hang a staircase, make it a feature instead of hiding it in a shaft. Add light wells on the roof to feed it. Your HVAC ducts could run along the beams instead of fighting them. You could leave the concrete exposed, seal it, celebrate it instead of covering it in drywall. They moved down a flight to the 5th floor, then the 4th. Each level told the same story. Neglect and potential, coiled together like two strands of a rope. On the 3rd floor, Malik stopped in the middle of the empty space and turned in a slow circle, seeing in his mind's eye glazed meeting rooms floating above open workspaces, green plants softening hard edges, acoustic panels soaking up echo. You could do a green roof, he said. This close to downtown, it would cut heat gain dramatically. Throw in solar on the south edge and you're halfway to net zero operations. Tenants would pay premium rates to say they're in a sustainable landmark. He realized he was breathing faster, almost lightheaded, not from the stairs, but from the rush of ideas cycling through him like they used to when he'd lose hours over a fresh set of plans. When he finally fell silent, there was a beat of quiet. Olivia was watching him, hands tucked into her pockets, expression inscrutable. How long has it been since you've talked about a building like that? She asked softly. Malik swallowed. 3 years, he said, almost exactly. What made you stop? My wife died, he said bluntly. There was no way to soften it. Car accident. I had a 2-year-old who needed a parent more than the city needed another high-rise. So I left. Maintenance pays less, but it doesn't call at midnight. It doesn't ask you to choose between deadlines and bedtime stories. She nodded, not in sympathy exactly, but in recognition. I read about the accident, she said. Small-town news sections are nosy. He stiffened. You looked me up that thoroughly? You're standing in one of the most valuable empty assets in this city, she said simply. I don't invite strangers to walk through it without knowing who they are. I know where you worked. I know what you designed. I know you disappeared from project credits right after your wife's obituary. Anger flickered, sharp and defensive. Then you know why I can't come back to this, he said. Not really, not like before. Instead of arguing, she walked to one of the dirty windows and looked out. From this height, you could see almost all of downtown. Blocks of brick and glass and concrete stretching to the river. The spires of old churches poking through the grid. People think I own everything out there, she said quietly. They say I own half the city like it's some kind of fairy tale. What they don't understand is that every building I touch becomes a promise. To tenants, to the city, to my father's memory. She turned back to him. I'm not asking you to come back like before. I'm asking you to help me keep a promise. One building, one project. We figure the rest out from there. The word promise sat heavy in the dusty air between them. What exactly are you offering? He asked. For now, she said. A consulting contract. I want you to sketch what you just described in your head. A concept, not some superficial test fit. Your real vision. I'll pay you fair rate for the hours. If I like what I see, we talk about making you lead architect for the project. He felt as if the floor had tilted beneath him. Lead architect? His voice came out strained. I haven't stamped a drawing set in 3 years. I don't even have current software licenses. I have software, she replied. I have engineers, code consultants, project managers. I don't have someone who sees what you see when you look at a place like this. You have a dozen big-name firms that would kill for this job. I do, she agreed. And I'm not convinced they love this city. They love their own portfolios. There's a difference. He looked down at his scuffed boots. At the calluses on his hands, earned not from tracing paper and mouse clicks, but from wrench handles and misbehaving boilers. This building will steal time from my son, he said, not accusing her but stating a fact. It'll mean late nights, early mornings, splitting my attention. I promised him I'd never disappear into work again. Then we don't let it steal him, she said. We build the project around the life you want, not the other way around. Flexible hours, work from home where you can. You're not 23 anymore, Malik. You don't have to worship the grind to do great work. Her certainty unnerved him. Think about it, she added, sensing his turmoil. I'm not asking for an answer today, but the city council is breathing down my neck about this building. I need a concept in 3 weeks. If you're in, we start now. If you're out, I call one of the glossy firms and we get something soulless but safe. They finished the walkthrough in relative silence, Malik jotting more notes in his folder almost in self-defense. Ceiling heights, column spacing, existing shaft locations. His muscle memory carried him even as his mind argued with itself. By the time they stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, he felt wrung out. Thanks for your time, Olivia said at the curb. Whatever you decide, the fence alone already makes you my favorite neighbor. He managed a weak smile. That fence was overbuilt just to annoy the wind. Exactly, she said. That's the energy I want in this building. He drove home with his brain buzzing, picking up Jalen from the after-school program on autopilot. The boy launched into a story about a science experiment gone wrong and glitter everywhere. Malik answered in half sentences, his mind still roaming the skeleton of Carson Block. After dinner, after homework and bath and bedtime stories, after the last, just one more glass of water, Dad, Malik found himself in the spare bedroom that served as their catch-all storage space. He pulled an old drafting board out from behind a stack of boxes. The sight of it made his chest ache. He had shoved it back there the week after the funeral and hadn't touched it since. He set it up by the window, cleared a space on the small table, and pinned a sheet of paper to it. His hand hovered over the surface for a long time before the pencil finally touched down. He started tentatively. Rough outlines, floor plates, a central void sketched as a rectangle of white in the middle of lines. As the minutes stretched into hours, the lines grew bolder. More confident, he drew stairs that wrapped and curved, section cuts that revealed floating mezzanines, light wells that pierced the roof and poured illumination down like a blessing. Outside, the city settled into night. In the next room, Jalen rolled over in his sleep. Inside the spare bedroom, a man who had once thought his best work was behind him rediscovered the hum in his blood that only came when a building began to reveal itself on paper. When he finally looked up, his hand cramped and his eyes burning, the digital clock on the dresser glowed 2:11 a.m. Malik stared at the joined pieces of paper spread across the board. It wasn't finished, not even close. But there, in graphite and eraser smudges, was the outline of a future he'd sworn he'd never risk again. He thought of Olivia standing in that dusty sixth floor, saying promises and decades in one building. He thought of Jalen's face at dinner when he'd casually mentioned he might help fix a big building downtown, the way the boy's eyes had lit up. Like design it, Jalen had asked. Something like that, Malik had hedged. Now looking at the sketches, he realized there was no something like that. This was designing. This was who he'd always been under the layers of grief and fear. His phone buzzed softly on the table with a new email. From Olivia. Subject: no pressure. Body: but if you decide yes, the board meets in 2 weeks. I'd like them to meet you as more than the guy who fixed my fence. Sleep on it. Decide in the morning. He typed a reply with fingers that shook only a little. I'm in. But I need one thing. This can't be at the expense of my son. If this job means missing his life, it's not worth it. Her response came 3 minutes later. Deal. We'll build something that makes both of you proud. Malik set the phone down next to the sketches and closed his eyes. He didn't know yet that the board had its own ideas about who deserved second chances, or that some of them would see black single dad from maintenance long before they saw award-winning architect. He only knew that, for the first time since the accident, he'd chosen something for himself, and that terrified him almost as much as it thrilled him. The first board meeting was worse than any client pitch Malik had ever experienced. 2 weeks after that late-night decision, he stood outside the glass-walled conference room on the 11th floor of Grant Urban Holdings headquarters, clutching a sleek black binder filled with preliminary concepts for the Carson block. Through the wall, he could see the board members taking their seats around the long polished table. They looked exactly like he'd expected. Suits in safe colors, watches that cost more than his truck, tablet screens lighting up as emails were checked and dismissed. "Ready?" Olivia asked quietly from beside him. "No," he said honestly, "but I'm here." "That's enough," she said. "For now." They stepped into the room together. Conversations dipped as faces turned toward them. Malik felt the weight of every gaze slide over his dark skin, his simple but well-pressed shirt, the calluses on his hands that no amount of lotion could erase. He was acutely aware that most architects they worked with probably walked in wearing custom suits and designer glasses, not department store ties and scuffed dress shoes. "Everyone," Olivia said, moving to the head of the table. "This is Malik Harris. He'll be consulting on the Carson block renovation." Consulting. Malik noted the deliberate choice of word. Easier to sell to a skeptical room than lead architect right out of the gate. Consulting? One man toward the middle of the table, silver hair, sharp nose, a tie knot so tight it looked painful, arched an eyebrow. "Meaning what exactly, Olivia? We already have 3 RFPs from established firms." "Yeah. This isn't about RFPs yet," she said. "This building is different. I wanted a fresh perspective before we commit. Malik has a background in architecture and deep knowledge of our properties from the maintenance side. He sees things the firms missed." The man's eyes flicked to Malik briefly, evaluating, before he forced a polite smile. "Of course, Nathan Cole, CFO," he said, extending a hand. Malik shook it, feeling the faint squeeze of dominance in the grip. "Pleasure to meet you," he said evenly. "Charlotte Wu," said a woman with dark, perfectly smooth hair and an expensive-looking pen between slim fingers. "Head of Development." "Tom Rivera," said another board member, a little softer around the edges than the others. "Operations." Names circled the room. Some gave him real eye contact. Some didn't. All were polite. None of them looked particularly thrilled. Olivia gestured toward the monitor at the end of the room. "Malik's prepared an initial concept for Carson," she said. "Before anyone panics, this is not a final plan. It's a vision, a direction. We'll talk numbers afterward." The next 20 minutes were a blur of slides and breath, and trying to keep his voice from shaking. He stood at the front of the room, his binder open, his sketches now transformed into clean, digital renderings by a freelance drafter Olivia had insisted on hiring. "So you're not up all night fighting glitchy software." He walked them through the idea, keeping the original brick facade, cutting a central atrium through the middle floors, adding a green roof and solar panels, creating flexible office spaces that could adapt to different tenant needs. He showed diagrams of improved daylight penetration, energy usage estimates, potential LEED certification pathways. As he spoke, the building came alive in his mind again, the way it could become not just another generic office box, but a statement about what downtown Lakewood wanted to be in the next decade. When he finished, there was a moment of silence that felt like standing in the eye of a storm. Then Nathan leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "It's very ambitious," Nathan said. In his tone, Malik heard other words. Expensive. Risky. Charlotte tapped her pen against her tablet. "The atrium removes leasable square footage on every floor," she pointed out. "That's revenue we're giving away. And the green roof. Nice for marketing, but a nightmare up front. The energy savings will pay for themselves in 7 to 10 years, Malik said. You recoup the costs and position the building a tier above everything else in the market. Tenants will pay more to be in a statement property." "That assumes the market agrees with your assessment," Nathan said. "We're not in Seattle, Mr. Harris. This is Lakewood. People here care about parking ratios, not sustainability awards." It wasn't outright contempt. It was worse. A kind of condescension colored by the assumption that he didn't understand money. Malik swallowed the reflexive surge of anger. I understand budgets, Malik said, and I understand the long-term cost of doing the bare minimum. This building has the potential to anchor 3 blocks of redevelopment if we treat it like more than a quick flip. Tom Rivera, who'd been quiet, flipped through the printout of Malik's slides. The structural modifications are significant, he said, more thoughtfully than critical. Have you run any preliminary numbers on reinforcement? I've done concept-level calculations, Malik said. We'd need the engineers to refine them. But the existing columns are over-designed by older code standards. They can carry more than they currently are. Olivia watched the back and forth, giving Malik room to stand on his own, but stepping in when needed to translate between vision and balance sheet. After another 15 minutes of questions, she finally said, no one's asking for a vote today. I wanted you to see what's possible beyond paint it and lease it. But we are going to have to vote, Nathan said. Soon. Carrying Carson vacant is already a drain. If we go down this road, we're tying up capital for 2 years minimum. And if we do something boring and cheap, we tie up an opportunity for 20, Olivia countered. The meeting ended with no resolution. Malik gathered his binder, noting which questions had landed and which had bounced off. As they stepped into the hallway, his shoulders sagged. They hate it, he said quietly. They don't hate it, Olivia replied. They're afraid of it. Fear makes people talk like spreadsheets. That's comforting, he said dryly. Olivia gave him a sideways look. You did well, she said. You held your ground. You spoke their language when you needed to, and the building's language when you had to. That's not easy. It didn't seem to convince them. It's the first round, Malik. No one wins a project like this in one pitch. We'll refine the numbers. Show them a version of their future they can't afford to say no to. The weeks that followed nearly broke him. By day, Malik still worked his maintenance job. He couldn't just quit. Bills didn't care about dreams. He rotated through buildings, fixing leaks and replacing filters, answering tenant complaints that ranged from legitimate emergencies to my light flickers when I slam the cabinet. In the early mornings and late nights after Jalen was asleep, he lived in the world of Carson Block, reworking layouts, tweaking mechanical chases, calculating sunlight angles with a level of obsessiveness that worried him. His laptop turned their small kitchen table into a war room. Sticky notes lined the wall, reminders, to-do items, scribbled structural questions he needed to run past a friend at an engineering firm in another city. He forgot to eat sometimes. He caught himself snapping at Jalen once when the boy wanted to show him a drawing and Malik was mid-flow on a detail. The look on his son's face stopped him cold. He knelt, eye level with the boy. I'm sorry, he said. You come first. My work brain just gets too loud sometimes. It's okay, Jalen said, but his voice was small. That night, Malik sat at the drafting board and stared at the lines without really seeing them. This isn't what I promised him, he thought. You said you wouldn't disappear again. The next morning, he adjusted. He carved out non-negotiable blocks of time, an hour in the afternoon when Jalen was home to play, talk, be present. Then once the boy slept, he let the building claim the remaining hours. 3 weeks later, the second board meeting arrived. This time, Malik came armed not just with slides, but with numbers Olivia's analysts had helped him assemble. Payback periods, comparative rent analyses, case studies of similar projects in cities only slightly ahead of Lakewood on the trendy graph. He started not with diagrams, but with a simple statement. Carson Block is going to cost you money either way, he said. The question isn't whether you spend, it's whether you buy a liability disguised as a quick win or an asset that makes everything around it more valuable. The discussion that followed was still tense, but less dismissive. Tom asked sharper questions. Charlotte challenged his phasing plan, but nodded at his tenant flexibility argument. Nathan remained cold, but his objections sounded more like tests than outright sabotage. When the meeting adjourned, Olivia caught up to Malik by the elevator. They're not saying yes yet, she said, but they're not saying no. That's not exactly encouraging, he said. It is, she insisted. In board speak, a lack of no is the first step toward a reluctant yes. We keep pushing. As if the universe had been waiting for the moment things looked marginally hopeful, that was when everything crashed into each other. The final make-or-break presentation to formally approve the project was scheduled for a Friday morning. Olivia managed to get city council observers and potential anchor tenants to attend, upping the stakes and the pressure. "This is it," she told Malik. "If they approve tomorrow, we're greenlit. If they don't, Carson goes back on the market, probably to someone who will turn it into storage. Or worse, tear it down." Malik spent the week refining his talk until every slide felt like an extension of his own heartbeat. He rehearsed in front of the mirror, in front of Jalen, who clapped at the before and after renderings, in his head while he waited in line at the grocery store. On Thursday afternoon, his phone rang while he was updating a detailed call-out. The number belonged to Jalen's school. His stomach dropped before he even answered. "Hello? Mr. Harris," came the nurse's calm voice. "Jalen's running a high fever. He says his chest hurts when he breathes deeply. We think he needs to see a doctor." Everything inside Malik went very, very quiet. "I'll be right there," he said. On the drive, his hands shook on the steering wheel. Fear coiled in his gut. Fear from the present, pneumonia, flu, asthma, overlaid with the old terror from that night 3 years ago when he'd raced to the hospital and lost his wife anyway. At the school office, Jalen sat in a plastic chair, cheeks flushed, eyes glassy. He reached for Malik with relief and clung to him, coughing. The urgent care clinic sent them straight to the hospital for tests. Within hours, Jalen was in a pediatric bed with IV antibiotics dripping into his arm and an oxygen monitor clipped to his finger. The doctor said serious infection and "we caught it early" in the same calm tone. Malik sat beside the bed, fingers wrapped around his son's small hand, listening to the rhythmic beep of machines. Only after Jalen fell into a medicated sleep did Malik realize he hadn't called Olivia. His phone showed 3 missed texts. "Everything okay? You disappeared from email. Call me when you can." He stepped into the hallway, leaned his back against the cool wall, and called her. She picked up on the second ring. "Malik?" "Jalen's in the hospital," he said without preamble. "They think it's pneumonia. He's on IV antibiotics." There was a brief pause. "Where?" he told her. "And the presentation tomorrow?" he asked, forcing the words out. I can try to come in for an hour if I—" "No," she said sharply. "Absolutely not. You stay with your son. The board will survive one meeting without you," she said. "I'll present your work. I know it as well as you do by now. I'll fight them if I have to." "Their last condition was that I present myself," he reminded her. Nathan practically said it. "If he can't show up, he can't show up for the project." "Let me worry about Nathan," she said. "You worry about Jalen." He closed his eyes, head tipping back against the wall. "This could cost you the project," he said softly. "Could cost you your position." "Maybe," she admitted, "but I can get another project. I can't get another you, and you can't get another son." He laughed once, a short, broken sound. "You realize how arrogant that sounds? Another you. I'm a middle-of-the-pack architect who got lost in grief." "You're better than middle," she said, "and grief doesn't erase talent. It just buries it for a while." He didn't sleep that night. He sat by Jalen's bed listening to the slow improvement in his breathing, the weakening of the fever. Around 3 a.m., he thumbed through photos on his phone. Baby Jalen in a dinosaur onesie, toddler Jalen in a cardboard box spaceship, kindergartner Jalen holding a Lego tower as tall as his chest. No building was worth more than this. No project, no comeback. If Carson Block died tomorrow, then that was the cost of being the father he'd promised to be. Back at headquarters the next morning, the atmosphere in the boardroom was somewhere between tense and predatory. Nathan opened the meeting with a pointed glare at the empty chair where Malik was supposed to sit. "So your consultant is unavailable," he said. "He had a family emergency," Olivia replied. "His son is in the hospital. I told him to stay there." "Unreliable," Charlotte murmured. "Human," Olivia corrected. "We're not machines." Nathan tapped a folder in front of him. "Company bylaws allow the board to override any external hiring decisions on contracts over $500,000. He said, "If the person in question cannot meet basic expectations, we are obligated to reassess." "You're quoting policy at me in my own building?" Olivia said mildly. "I'm reminding you that while you may own half the city, as the papers like to say, This company is still answerable to shareholders, Nathan said. We can't let personal pet projects put our position at risk. He pressed a button on the remote. Malik's renderings appeared on the screen. You've fallen in love with a vision drawn by a man who hasn't practiced in 3 years and whose primary job now is fixing toilets, he said. We have offers from 3 firms with proven track records, and yet you're risking Carson, and by extension, our downtown footprint, on him. Why? Olivia could feel every eye in the room on her. Because he sees more than they do, she said. He sees what the building wants to be. He sees the city not just as a collection of parcels, but as a living organism. That matters. You can't quantify vision on a spreadsheet, Nathan said sharply. That doesn't make it worthless, she shot back. The argument escalated. Nathan pushed for a vote to scrap Malik's involvement and restart the process with a new architect. Charlotte, ever pragmatic, leaned in that direction. Tom looked conflicted. We gave you 2 cycles, Olivia, Nathan said finally. Either we move forward with a real firm, or we move to call a shareholder meeting to review leadership. That's not a threat. It's a procedural reality. He wanted her position. The thought flashed across her mind with sudden clarity. He wanted Carson as his example of her emotional mismanagement. She could cave. She could cut Malik loose with a sympathetic note and hire one of the safe firms. She'd keep her title. She'd keep the board's peace. She thought of Malik's hands drawing on cheap paper at a kitchen table, of the way his eyes had lit up describing staircases and skylights, of the fear in his voice when he'd said he couldn't risk losing his son's childhood. She thought of her father, sitting at the dining room table surrounded by unpaid invoices and half-finished house plans, saying, I thought I had to choose, Liv. Family or dreams? Turned out I chose regret. No, she said quietly, surprising even herself with the calm in her voice. We're not firing him. Then we move to vote on your decision-making, Nathan said. Before you do that, she said, standing, I'm going to show you the rest of the story you're trying to cancel halfway through. She spent the next 20 minutes walking them through Malik's design as if she'd drawn every line herself. She spoke of air patterns and energy profiles, of tenant retention rates in green-certified buildings, of the intangible but very real value of giving Lakewood a building people would point to and say, that changed things. By the end, Tom was nodding. Charlotte's eyes had softened, and even Nathan looked a little less certain. Here's my compromise, Olivia said. We give Malik one more shot, one final formal presentation when his son is out of danger. If he doesn't convince you then, I'll terminate his contract myself, and I'll accept whatever review you want to throw at me. It was a gamble, and they all knew it. Tom spoke first. One more presentation seems fair, he said. We've already seen more thought in this concept than in all the generic proposals combined. Charlotte pursed her lips, then nodded slowly. Fine. One more round. No more. Nathan leaned back, weighing odds and leverage. In the end, he nodded too. Very well, he said. One last chance. But if it fails, your fence builder is gone, and we will have a separate conversation about your tendency to prioritize sentiment over stability. Deal, Olivia said. Schedule it for 2 weeks. Friday. When she left the boardroom, her legs felt like they might give out. She drove straight to the hospital. Jalen was sitting up in bed when she arrived, cheeks less flushed, watching a cartoon with the sound low. Malik, in the chair beside him, looked like he hadn't slept in a decade. He started to apologize before she even sat down. I'm sorry, Olivia. I know this ruins everything. I should have... Stop, she said. You were exactly where you were supposed to be. She told him everything. The board's anger, the attempted override, the ultimatum, the fragile truce of one last chance. My career is basically riding shotgun with yours now, she finished with a crooked smile. So, no pressure. He stared at her. Why would you do that? He asked hoarsely. Why tie yourself to someone who might fail in front of everyone? Because someone I loved once talked himself out of a second chance, she said, and I watched him regret it until the day he died. I won't watch it happen twice. She told him about her father then, about the years he'd spent caring for her mother, about how, when she died, he tried to go back to architecture and found the doors closed, how he'd built the foundation of Grant Urban Holdings as a construction outfit instead, always with a trace of sadness in his eyes when he drove past buildings he hadn't gotten to design. He used to stand at the edge of job sites and say, "If I'd had one person believe in me at the right time," Olivia said, "I couldn't be that person for him. I can be it for someone else." Tears burned in Malik's eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted. "I thought I could, but I'm tired all the time. I'm out of practice. I feel like an imposter every time I walk into that boardroom." "In other words, you feel like every person who ever tried to do something that mattered," she said. "Welcome to the club." They both glanced at Jalen as he stirred, then settled again. Machines beeped softly, a steady reminder of what was truly at stake. "2 weeks," Olivia said quietly. "You get your son well, you clear your head, then you show them what you showed me in that dusty building. Not the polished, palatable version, the real thing." "Even if they hate it?" he asked. "Especially if they do," she said. "If you're going down, go down telling the truth about the building, not trying to guess what a roomful of cautious people want to hear." That night, for the first time since his wife's death, Malik allowed himself to ask a dangerous question. What if the lesson he was teaching Jalen wasn't be safe, but never try? The thought unsettled him so deeply he couldn't sit still. While Jalen slept, he paced the corridor, his mind replaying the past 3 years through a new lens. He'd left architecture to be present. That was good. But somewhere along the way, he'd also left his own sense of possibility. That was not. Jalen woke the next day hungry and cranky. Both good signs, the nurse said with a smile. By Sunday, they were home with a sack of medications and a stern lecture about rest. On Monday night, after tucking Jalen into his bed with strict instructions to call me if you need literally anything, Malik stood alone in the doorway of the spare room. The drafting board waited. So did the laptop. So did the fear. He sat, picked up the pencil, and this time he didn't start by asking, "What will the board accept?" He started by asking, "What does this building want to be? What does this city need?" The lines that followed felt different, less apologetic, more certain. He ripped up entire sheets, moved the atrium, added a rooftop community garden accessible to more than just tenants, a gesture to the city, not just the balance sheet. He simplified some structural gymnastics that had been there to impress rather than serve. He worked until dawn, not because he was desperate to prove anything, but because, for the first time in 3 years, he was in love with the act of designing again. 2 weeks later, the man who walked into the boardroom was still exhausted, still grieving, still aware of how precarious his second chance was. But he was also something else. He was an architect again. The morning of the final presentation dawned cool and clear, the kind of autumn day that made downtown Lakewood's brick facades glow warm against a blue sky. Malik stood in front of the mirror in his bedroom and straightened his tie. It was the same tie he'd worn to his wife's funeral. For years, it had lived at the back of the closet, heavy with unspoken memories. Today, for the first time, it felt less like an anchor and more like a thread tying his past to a different future. In the next room, Jalen sat at the kitchen table swinging his feet, a cereal spoon clinking against his bowl. "You sure you're okay to go?" Malik asked for the third time, emerging from the hallway. Jalen rolled his eyes in exaggerated 7-year-old exasperation. "Dad, it's just school. I'm fine. I can breathe." "Look." He took an overly dramatic deep breath to prove it. "See?" Malik smiled, relief and residual worry warring in his chest. Okay. Drama king. Remember, Miss Lopez knows to call me if you even look like you might fall over." "I know," Jalen said. "And after school, can we drive past your building?" "Hopefully," Malik said, "if today goes well." "It will," Jalen said with the absolute faith of someone who hadn't yet learned what it felt like to have life disappoint him. "You're the best builder." "I'm not a builder," Malik corrected automatically. "I'm an—" He stopped himself, realization dawning. "I'm an architect," he said. The word tasted strange and right on his tongue. Jalen grinned. "Exactly." At headquarters, the atmosphere was electric. More people filled the boardroom than Malik had ever seen. Board members, yes, but also 2 city council representatives, a potential anchor tenant's regional director, and even a reporter from the local business journal. Olivia met him at the door, her blazer sharper than usual, her expression unreadable to anyone who didn't know her well. Malik had learned that her calmest face often hid her fiercest resolve. "You ready?" she asked. This time he didn't say no. "Yes," he said. "I am." He set up without fumbling, connected his laptop, tested the clicker. When everyone settled, Olivia cleared her throat. "Thank you all for coming," she said. "You know why we're here. Carson Block has been a question mark on our books for years. Today I believe that question mark becomes an exclamation point. Malik?" He took the spot at the front of the room, heart pounding but steady. "I could start with numbers," he said, "with cost projections and market comps. We'll get to those. But I want to start with a story instead. The story of a building that's been part of Lakewood longer than any of us have worked here." The screen behind him changed to a black and white photo Olivia's team had dug up. A shot of Carson Block in 1963, fresh and clean, storefronts bustling, people in hats and gloves moving along the sidewalks. "This is Carson the year it opened," Malek said. "It was built by a local contractor who believed downtown could be the beating heart of this town. It held doctors' offices, small businesses, the first integrated law firm in the county." He clicked. The next slide showed the building decades later, colors fading, signage cluttered, windows patched. Over the years, like a lot of downtowns in mid-sized American cities, Lakewood shifted. Malls, then the internet, pulled commerce away. Carson weathered it. For a while, tenants changed, purpose shifted, maintenance was deferred. Eventually, it emptied out. He looked around the room. Right now, everyone sees this building as a problem, an expense, a line item we'd all rather not look at. I'm asking you to see it as a chance, not just to fix one address, but to make a statement about what this city values. He clicked again. This time, the rendering filled the screen. Gasps, actual, audible gasps, rippled through the room. Carson's brick facade had been cleaned and repaired, its original patterns and details brought back to life. New windows glowed with warm light. A subtle glass addition crowned the top, framing the rooftop garden. Lush greenery spilled just enough over the edges to be visible from the street without looking unruly. "We're not erasing Carson's history," Mullick said. "We're revealing it. The brick stays. The rhythm of windows stays. But behind that familiar face, everything changes." He walked them through floor plans that showed the central atrium, sunlight cascading down through carefully placed skylights. He showed flexible layouts that could accommodate startups and established firms alike. He zoomed in on the rooftop, a mix of solar panels and planted beds, with a small public terrace open at certain hours, giving residents a view of their own downtown most had never seen. He talked about energy models, yes, but he also talked about quality of life. "A building like this doesn't just house workers," he said. "It tells them their time matters, that their city values light and air and beauty, not just square footage." Then, because he knew this room, he turned to the numbers. Operating costs slashed by 28% over 10 years. Rental rate premiums of 15% compared to standard stock. Projected payback of sustainability investments in 8 years, after which the building's net profit margin surpassed anything achievable with a cheaper conventional renovation. "If you're worried about risks," he concluded, "I understand. I'm a single father. I live with risk calculations in my head all day. But sometimes the bigger risk is playing small when the world is changing around you." When he finished, there was silence again. Not the wary kind this time. Something weightier. The city councilwoman spoke first. "This is the kind of project we've been begging for," she said. "Not another cookie-cutter glass box, but a transformation that respects where we came from. I can't speak for the whole council, but you'd have my full support and probably some incentive tools we can discuss." The potential tenants rep nodded. "If this building looks half as good as these renderings, we're interested. Our younger staff want to work somewhere that feels intentional. This does." Tom cleared his throat, clearly moved. "Mr. Harris," he said, "I was skeptical. I'll admit it. But this is," he searched for the word, "this is extraordinary." Charlotte, never sentimental, tapped her tablet with a manicured fingernail. "The numbers check out," she said. "I had my analyst run worst-case scenarios while you were speaking. Even then, this outperforms a standard renovation by year 10. All eyes shifted to Nathan. He sat very still, face unreadable. Malik's palms dampened. Finally, Nathan exhaled through his nose, a fraction too sharply. I still don't like the risk profile, he said. I still don't like tying our flagship downtown project to someone with a gap this large in his professional history. Malik braced for the blow. But, Nathan continued grudgingly, I can't argue with the design, or the projections, or the fact that our councilwoman is practically vibrating with excitement. A ripple of restrained laughter eased the tension. So, Nathan said, I'll vote yes, with the understanding that milestones are non-negotiable and overruns are not an option. Olivia's gaze flicked to Malik, pride and relief and something like vindication shining in her eyes. When the vote was called, every hand went up. Motion carries, Charlotte said. Carson block renovation approved. Design direction as presented. Applause broke out. Polite from some, genuine from others. Malik stood there, a little stunned, as if someone had reached into his chest and flipped a switch from survival mode to alive. After the meeting, people filed past him, shaking his hand, offering congratulations, asking follow-up questions. The reporter asked for a quote. Malik fumbled something about honored and committed to the city. When the room finally emptied, he and Olivia stood alone for a moment by the window, looking out at the very skyline they were about to change. Told you, she said softly. That they'd say yes, he asked. No, she said. That you had more in you than you thought. He swallowed hard, emotion thick in his throat. Thank you, he said, for seeing whatever this is before I did. I saw a man who rebuilt a fence like it was guarding something sacred, she said. Turned out, I was right. The months that followed were a blur of drawings and meetings, hard hats and site walks. Malik officially left his maintenance job when the first full design contract came through. Grant Urban Holdings hired him not as a freelancer, but as project architect for Carson Block. When the board saw how well he coordinated with engineers and consultants, when change orders came in lower than expected and schedules stayed on track, his title quietly shifted. Project architect became lead architect. Lead architect became director of adaptive reuse a year later. He set strict boundaries from day one. Mornings were for meetings and team coordination. Afternoons were for Jalen. School pickups, homework, basketball and the cracked asphalt court at the neighborhood park. Evenings, once Jalen was asleep, he'd settle at the drafting board or the laptop. It wasn't perfect. There were nights he worked too late and mornings when coffee felt like a lifeline. But Jalen never stopped seeing him at the breakfast table, never waited alone at a bus stop wondering if his father would show. On weekends, they visited the site together. Jalen watched cranes swing steel, listened to the clank of hammers. That's your building, he'd say proudly. It's our building, Malik would correct. You and me and Miss Olivia and 100 other people. Buildings like this are never just one person. The press started to notice. Single father architect leads downtown revival, read one headline. From maintenance tech to city shaper, read another. Malik hated the way they made his grief sound like a plot twist, but he understood the power of the narrative. At the opening ceremony 18 months later, the Carson block looked both entirely new and entirely itself. Brick gleamed, windows shone. The rooftop garden spilled soft green against the skyline. Inside, the atrium glowed with filtered light, plants cascading down from balcony railings, staircases winding gracefully between floors. The mayor cut a ribbon. The councilwoman gave a speech. Olivia spoke about her father and about promises to cities and to the people who live in them. Then she called Malik to the microphone. He looked out at the crowd, colleagues, city officials, neighbors from Willow Lane who had taken the bus downtown just to see his building. In the front row, Jalen stood between their elderly neighbor Mrs. Owens and Olivia, dressed in a little button-down shirt he hated but had accepted because it's Dad's big day. Malik cleared his throat. 3 years ago, he began, I thought my life as an architect was over. I left this profession to be a good father. I assumed the two roles couldn't coexist. He glanced at Jalen, whose dark eyes were fixed on him with radiant pride. I was wrong, Mikakon, Malik said. What I've learned is that sometimes being the parent your child needs means showing them what it looks like to do the hard things scared, to try again when it would be easier to stay small. He spoke briefly about the building, about adaptive reuse and sustainability and respect for the past, but he ended with something else. If there's anyone out there who stepped away from a dream because life demanded it, and you're wondering if it's too late to come back, I'm here to tell you it's not, he said. Dreams don't expire. They wait. Sometimes all it takes is one person to see you clearly and say, you still can. For me, that person was my neighbor, who happened to own half the town. Laughter rippled through the crowd at that line, but it was affectionate, not mocking. In the end, he finished, this building didn't just get a second chance. I did too, and I intend to spend the rest of my life paying that forward. Applause rose, loud, sustained, rolling up against the restored brick like a blessing. Later, after the speeches and the tours and the endless photos, Malik and Jalen slipped away to the rooftop garden. From there, the city spread out in all directions, a patchwork of old and new, bricks and trees and asphalt and possibility. Mom would like this, Jalen said quietly, leaning against the railing. Malik swallowed past the lump in his throat. Yeah, he said, I think she would. It was the first time he'd said her name out loud in a public place in years, without feeling like the air had been punched out of his lungs. The grief was still there, but it had softened around the edges, making room for other feelings. That evening, they drove home down streets that looked different to Malik now. Not because the buildings had changed, but because he had. The city no longer felt like a place he moved through. It felt like something he was helping shape. They passed Olivia's house on Willow Lane. The fence still stood straight and strong, the diagonal brace he'd insisted on all but invisible under the paint. Can we stop? Jalen asked. They pulled over. The three of them ended up in the front yard, Malik leaning on one post, Olivia with her hands in her pockets, Jalen running his fingers along the smooth boards. Hard to believe this is where it all started, Malik said. It didn't start here, Olivia said. It started years ago with you and a sketchbook and big ideas. The fence just gave you a detour back. Jalen frowned in thought. If the storm hadn't knocked it down, would you still have met Dad? He asked Olivia. We might have, she said. I probably would have hired him sooner or later for something. People like your dad have a way of showing up where they're needed. Jalen nodded, satisfied. Months later, Malik sat in a small office on the 9th floor of Carson Block, now fully occupied. His name was on the glass door. Malik Harris, AIA, Director of Adaptive Reuse. He was interviewing a young woman for a junior architect position. Her resume showed top grades, strong design sense, and a 2-year gap. Caregiver for my grandmother, she said, watching his face as if waiting for it to close. I know it looks bad. It looks like life happened, Malik said. Tell me about the last project you worked on that made you forget what time it was. Her eyes lit up. She launched into an animated description of a studio project converting an old factory into mixed-income housing. As she spoke, Malik heard not rustiness, but raw potential. He offered her the job before she left the room. After she was gone, he opened his email. A message waited from a community college student, a single father considering dropping out of night classes to be realistic. Your story makes me feel like maybe I'm not crazy for wanting more, the student had written. But I don't want to hurt my kid trying. How did you know it was worth it? Malik thought of all the times he hadn't known, of nights in hospital corridors and mornings on job sites, wondering if he'd made a mistake, of the weight of Olivia's belief, of Jalen's quiet, unwavering faith. He began to type. I didn't know, he wrote. I was terrified most of the time. I still am some days. The point isn't not being scared. It's deciding what you want your kid to learn from watching you. If they see you give up on yourself, they learn that's what adults do. If they see you take careful, thoughtful risks to build a life you care about, they learn that's possible too. Find one person who believes in you and let them in on your fears. That's where my second chance started, with a neighbor and a broken fence. He hit send. On the way home that day, he and Jalen drove past Carson Block. The setting sun caught the brick just right, turning it almost gold. People spilled out of the lobby, laughing, holding laptops, living lives that would never know how close this building had come to being written off as scrap. That's ours, Jalen said proudly. pressing his face to the window. It's everyone's, Malik said softly. That's the point. They turned onto Willow Lane. Olivia's bungalow came into view, tidy and familiar, the fence line straight as a ruler. Malik remembered that first afternoon, his hands rough with splinters, the taste of lemonade, the feel of being watched not as the help, but as something more. He'd gone over to fix a neighbor's fence, thinking he was just shoring up a boundary line before the next storm. He hadn't realized he was also repairing a breach inside himself, replacing rotten posts where his belief had once stood. He hadn't known the woman in the hoodie and jeans owned half the town's real estate. He hadn't known she'd use that power not to keep him in his place, but to pull him back into the arena he'd abandoned. He parked in his driveway and sat for a moment, listening to the tick of the cooling engine. "You okay, Dad?" Jalen asked. "Yeah," Malik said. "Just thinking about how weird life is." "Like how a fence can give you a whole building?" Jalen said. Malik laughed. "Exactly like that." That night, after homework and dinner and one more chapter of the book they were reading together, Malik stood in the doorway of Jalen's room, watching his son sleep. Sometimes in the quiet moments, he still heard the echo of his old fear, that by reaching for his dream again, he might drop something precious. But then he looked at Jalen, healthy, loved, secure, and at the stack of drawings on his own desk in the other room, and he realized something simple and profound. He hadn't chosen between father and architect. He'd chosen to become both, fully. And in doing so, he'd given his son a front row seat to what courage looked like in real life. Not as a movie moment, but as 1,000 small decisions to keep going when it would be easier to retreat. Before bed, Malik walked past the drafting table and laid his hand on a fresh set of plans, this time for a dilapidated community center in a struggling neighborhood across town. Another building everyone else had written off. Another chance to prove that nothing and no one was beyond repair if someone cared enough to see what they could be. He smiled, turned off the light, and let the darkness settle around him, not as something to fear, but as space where new shapes could emerge. Fences, buildings, lives. All, it turned out, could be rebuilt.